Hello, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Cheryl Engstrom. You're not seeing me, you're seeing our two wonderful presenters. I want to do a very brief introduction before we get started. Alicia Mazzara is the Senior Research Analyst, and Oliva, I just asked you this, didn't I? Oliva is the Vice President of Housing for the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. I am thrilled to have them here today because in all the years that I've been helping to prepare Housing Washington speakers and get them assigned, we have not had anybody from the CBPP, and it's exciting to have them here today to talk about some of the programs that they have going on. So I am not going to take any more of your time except to say, please go ahead and put any questions you have throughout this in the chat, so we can make sure that we have an opportunity at the end to tap into the chat and get some questions answered. So with that, Anne and Alicia, I would love to have you start, and welcome to Housing Washington.
Great, thank you so much, Cheryl. We're so happy to be here. Thank you for asking us to participate in this conference. It's just a really important conference. It feels like you have a really broad range of housing and homelessness experts in your state here with us today. So again, thank you for having us. Just a little bit more about us before we start digging in to our material. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities is one of the nation's leading policy institutes that focuses on federal and state issues affecting low and moderate income households and individuals. That's where our policy focus sits. We are sort of best known for conducting rigorous analysis, developing policy ideas and strategies, and helping to shape a broad array of federal and state policy efforts. Our teams span a wide range of subject matters that includes federal and state budget and tax policy. That is not me. You cannot ask me any questions about tax policy today, but we have a great team on that. Healthcare, social insurance, nutrition, income assistance, and of course, housing. So again, my name is Ann Oliva. I am the Vice President for Housing Policy, and I have with me today one of my colleagues who is just an outstanding member of our team, Alicia Mazzara, who is really our data guru. So today, we're going to start with the numbers. It's always important to ground ourselves in this kind of information, especially information that's changing a lot as the COVID-19 pandemic evolves. So we're going to talk about what data we have, particularly something called the Pulse survey, what it tells us about the pandemic and about hardship, especially around housing hardship. I know that we have a number of people in the audience today from the homelessness field. I myself, that is my particular area of expertise. And I'm happy to have you all with us today. And on that data, we don't know yet the impact nationally, but we have some pre-pandemic data that tells us about what was already happening around homelessness before the pandemic hit in March of 2020. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Alicia, can you tell us a bit about what was happening around homelessness and housing instability before the pandemic to help us understand the landscape, but then also talk a bit about what the Pulse survey is, what it includes, and what the data collected tells the COVID-19 pandemic and housing hardship in particular. Alicia?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Okay. All right. There we go. All right. So we're going to do a little context setting because I think it's really important to understand what was happening before, to understand what's happening now, because part of the reason that we are seeing so many people struggle to afford the rent or to stay housed is because we were having a lot of problems beforehand. And some people would say we were already in a housing crisis, and now we're just seeing even stronger effects of that. And so you can see this chart here is really showing that unsheltered homelessness has been rising since 2015. And so there are already some signs that there was stuff happening even before the pandemic started. So in January 2020, which is when HUD does their kind of annual point in time count of homelessness, we're already seeing that 30 states were reporting that there was a rise in homelessness. So already kind of portending what was to come. And in addition, the first time since this data has been collected, we saw that the number of folks that were living unsheltered exceeded the number of people in shelters. I also want to note that homelessness, right, is not experienced equally. We know that it falls disproportionately on people of color, particularly Black people. One example of that from the January 2020 point in time count, we see that over half of families with children experiencing homelessness were Black. So this is really kind of all related, and we're going to keep going back to the history, the policy decisions, the history of our country that has created discrimination in housing, that has created barriers to access to housing, as well as employment and education. All these things sort of fit together that make it such that people of color, particularly Black people, have a greater likelihood of experiencing homelessness and housing instability and having a harder time accessing housing. So let me get to the next slide. So in addition to people who are experiencing homelessness, we also have people who are kind of on the economic precipice. They're really struggling to pay their rent. And so we saw that even before the pandemic, some 24 million people in low-income households were saying, hey, I'm paying more than half my income for rent. And when we break this down by race, ethnicity, we see it is largely people of color who are facing those burdens for kind of all the reasons that we just talked about. So into this context, we have the pandemic, and the Census Bureau rightly thought to themselves, hey, you know, we usually collect data once a year. We really need to know what is happening real time on the ground for people. And so they launched this thing called the Pulse Survey. It's near real-time data. It's collected basically every day. They send out a survey to folks. It's reported every 2 weeks. And it has a ton of questions about people's economic situation, their health situation, their housing situation. Are they getting enough to eat? All different types of things to try and sort of track how people are doing during the pandemic. And so this has given us a chance to really monitor what's been going on with people's ability to pay their rent over the course of the pandemic. So this chart is showing, you know, the share of adults that say their household is not caught up on the rent, and it's tracked twice a month over the last year. And what you can see is we kind of peaked in January at about 20%, or 1 in 5 adult renters saying my household is not caught up on rent. That's gone down somewhat, and we think, and we'll talk more about some of the things that we think contributed to that decline potentially. But you see in the last few months, it's been pretty sticky. It's really been hovering around 15, 16%, which is 1 in 5 adult renters saying, hey, my household is behind on rent. And that translates to around 12 million people. So then if people are behind on rent, kind of the next logical question becomes, well, how far behind are they on rent? And so we recently got this data from Census where people could indicate how many months they're behind, right? Because we know that even if some people have been previously protected by an eviction moratorium or something, they're still accumulating debt. Most folks that are saying they're behind, they're between 1 and 3 months behind, but a pretty troubling 20+% of adults were reporting that they are 4 or more months behind on rent. So if you think about, you know, how much you pay in rent or for your mortgage, and you multiply that by 4, 6, 8, that really adds up. So you've got some people who are at real serious risk of eviction because there's some significant debt that's been accumulated. Am I supposed to pause to let you ask another question, Anne, or am I?
No, yeah, let's actually move on to the next question. I'm sorry. So there's a lot of people experiencing hardship as a result of the pandemic. You just sort of laid that out for us. There were a lot of people experiencing hardship before the pandemic. But can you tell us a little bit about who is getting hit the hardest? And you touched on it just like for a minute, but can you talk about racial disparities and how historically marginalized communities have fared during the pandemic?
Yeah, so let me talk about that in a couple ways. So one is that we see low wage workers being hit the hardest, and low wage workers tend to be predominantly Black and brown people. These are the jobs that you cannot easily translate to working from home. So there are also a lot of the same people who in the earlier data in that earlier chart I showed were people who were low wage workers who were, despite being employed, still saying, hey, I'm paying over half my income for my housing. Like my work does not pay enough to meet my cost of living. So these are folks that were already financially stretched before the pandemic started, and then they're being kind of hardest hit in terms of, the jobs that got cut during this. And so what we see then is when you actually break apart the people who are behind on rent, we see that it is very much falling disproportionately on people of color. We've seen, this is the most recent data, but honestly, pretty consistently, we see that Black, Asian, and Latino renters are reporting that they are between 1 to 2 times, 2.5 times more likely to be behind on rent compared to white renters. Again, for all the reasons we talked about structurally and all the sort of kind of racial disparities and unequal opportunities that we had coming into this pandemic are then kind of being borne out in this data here.
So there's also a really large body of research on the impacts of hardship, in our case, housing hardship, or housing instability and homelessness on children and families. We know, for example, that HUD's family options study that was done a number of years ago and that continues to track families over time. We know that safe and stable housing improves a variety of health and educational outcomes for kids. We know that safe and stable housing decreases domestic violence, decreases homelessness, and decreases overcrowding. We also know that the impacts of hardship can be long-lasting for kids. So can you talk a little bit about how the pandemic has impacted families and the effects on children in particular?
Yes, so we've consistently seen that families with children are more likely to say that they're behind on their rent than households that don't have any children in them. About 1 in 5 families with children are saying they're behind on rent, and that's been pretty consistent throughout the pandemic. When we look at the children of renters, we see that the children of renters are, about 1/3 of them are either in a household that is behind on its rent or did not have enough to eat in the last 7 days. And in some cases, some of those are the same household. So they're experiencing both food and rent hardship. So I think what that means is that you're seeing families make really difficult trade-offs in how they're using their financial resources. Do I pay the rent? Do I make sure we have food? And so people are in like a very, it's not the kind of decision that anyone wants to have to make.
Yeah. So you've given us a really good sense of where we are nationally, and what we saw pre-pandemic and how the pandemic has impacted a variety of different kinds of hardship for individuals and families. What does the data tell us about Washington State?
So I've got a little slide here for Washington State, and we try really hard to publish state data whenever we can. So if Washington wants to compare it to its peer states or anything like that, we have that there. So what we're seeing is about 176,000 adults saying their household is not caught up on rent. And then there's an additional 23,000 people reporting that they were experiencing homelessness in a single night in January. So that's around 200,000 people. In addition, there's over 300,000 people saying their household didn't get enough to eat in the last 7 days. But the one that really strikes me, I think, is this 1.2 million adults saying their household had difficulty covering their usual expenses. I think that really shows, Obviously, people make different economic trade-offs in their household, but it just shows you the widespread impact of the pandemic, and it's sort of manifesting in all these different ways for kind of the basic needs that people are trying to provide for themselves. So I've done a lot of talking about the data, and I think we have a pretty good picture. But I want to turn it over to Anne to talk a little bit more about, with all of this stuff going on in the pandemic, what has been done to address it, and like, how is that going?
That was a really good question, Alicia. I'm going to put something, if you go to the next slide, I'm also going to put a link in the chat. I'm not sure if it can go, Cheryl, if it goes to everyone who's watching, but it's just a link for folks to use if they can access it. So right now, great, everybody can see it. Right now, there are 4 major programs that have been funded under sort of the broad umbrella of pandemic relief that are related to housing instability and homelessness. And I just want to note that the scale of this funding, I mean, you all out in the field know this as well, if not better than I do. The scale is quite unprecedented. And just to give you an idea of what I mean by that, before this pandemic, the largest homelessness prevention or eviction prevention program, which I actually ran when I was at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, was the Homelessness Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Program that was funded as part of the Recovery Act in 2009. That program was the biggest program ever for eviction and homelessness prevention at $1.5 billion. So the scale of what we're talking about is quite unprecedented, both as Alicia described in terms of impact on human beings and in terms of funding that we are sort of working on in the field. The largest of those programs, obviously, is the one on the left-hand side of this chart, which is the Emergency Rental Assistance Program that was funded at nearly $50 billion. So this array of resources includes a number of sort of interlocking and interrelated eligible activities and priorities that include things like emergency response and emergency shelter or services to people who are living unsheltered through the Emergency Solutions Grants CV program funded at $4 billion. That was part of the CARES Act. That really is targeted to people who are currently experiencing homelessness or who are at very high risk of homelessness. And that was distributed last year. We also have emergency housing vouchers, that's permanent or supportive housing, depending on whether it's coupled with services, for up to 70,000 vouchers. Those vouchers they're not time limited to the family or household that receives them, but they cannot be reissued by your public housing authority after September of 2023. So they are budget limited to $5 billion. And that is targeted to folks who are currently or recently experiencing or at risk of homelessness, as well as survivors of domestic violence. Those funds have also been allocated. They were passed as part of the American Rescue Plan, and they have been allocated by HUD. Continuums of care and public housing authorities really just finished negotiating how they're going to prioritize those vouchers, and they're getting onto the street now. Then we also have resources in that right-hand column for things like developing supportive and affordable housing through the HOME program, specifically for people who are at risk of or experiencing homelessness, survivors of domestic violence, and veterans, as well as some other high-risk populations. And then you have the very large emergency rental assistance program that was actually funded in 2 parts through last December's omnibus budget. That was ERA 1 and ERA 2, which was funded through the American Rescue Plan, really targeted to folks who Alicia was talking about, who have been hard hit by the pandemic, who are behind on their rent, and we could keep them in their housing with some resources to help pay back rent, back utilities, as well as forward or prospective rent that would help them continue to be stable over the next few coming months. All of these programs, as I mentioned, are in various stages of implementation. Probably the one that gets the most public and media attention is the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, because it is so big and it is really targeted to folks who are at risk of eviction. But the other programs are also in various stages of implementation. ESGCV was funded through the CARES Act, so that's the furthest along. Emergency housing vouchers just getting on the street right now, and HUD just released its guidance for the home program, homeless assistance funding, just a few weeks ago. And then the last thing that I want to note is, in addition to these 4 big programs, we also had a national eviction moratorium in place beginning in September of 2020 that made a huge difference to the households who are behind on rent, the same households that you, Alicia, described in your data.
All right, so we have all these things happening now in response to like what's going on, but you know, we're gonna have, at some point the pandemic will end, but we'll have another crisis, right? There'll be other emergencies. So like what else needs to happen so that we're not always in this place of being so reactive?
Another really good question that a lot of us in this field, and I think a lot of people who are experiencing housing instability and homelessness, are asking themselves and their leaders. If you can go to the next slide. I'll put the link in the chat as well. I'm not sure if folks saw this over the weekend. This is referencing an opinion piece that was written by Matthew Desmond, who is the author of Evicted, over the weekend in the New York Times, really talking about what's happening in the housing, in the affordable housing world right now. And the piece itself is outstanding. You should take a look at it. But this quote from that piece has stuck with me since I read it. And I just think it's really important to ground us in what we're talking about as I think about the answer to your question, Alicia. So if the lesson that we take away from this past 2 years or from the eviction moratorium is to figure out how to do a better eviction moratorium for the next emergency, we will have failed. What we should be thinking about and what we should be dedicating ourselves to is building a better housing system, one that really ensures that we don't face this kind of crisis come the next pandemic or next year. I'm going to put that in the chat so folks can link to it on the New York Times website. If you go to the next slide. So when you ask that question, the answer is that we do that. We get ready for the next thing by doing 3 things. And that is preserving the affordable housing that we have, building additional stock where we need it. And I know in Washington State, especially in the King County area, but in other areas throughout the state, I've had the pleasure of working in your state for a number of years, for the last 4 or 5 years, actually. And I know that there are places in your state where we really need to build stock. So preserving what we have, building additional stock where we need it. And then I think most importantly to us is increasing affordability for as many low and extremely low income people and households as we can. So how do you do that? You use a program that has a really strong evidence base and that can expand and contract as the need changes. And that, having something like that in place is good for families, it's good for individuals, and it's good for landlords. So we think that we do that by expanding the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And in the long run, what we really want to push for is universal housing vouchers, which means that everybody who's eligible for a housing voucher actually gets one. But for right now, what we're pushing for is as much of an expansion as we can possibly get in this moment, so that it will really make a big difference in the lives of the folks, Alicia, that you described at the top of this session. So this slide is just to show you that the Housing Choice Voucher Program is currently, it's not perfect, and I don't want folks to walk away thinking that there aren't policy changes that need to be made. We also need to implement things at protections like source of income discrimination protections and housing navigation services for folks. There's a number of things that need to change, but the Housing Choice Voucher Program is really effective, and it is currently really just constrained by funding. Right now, only, you can see in the pie chart on the left, only 1 in every 4 eligible households receives a voucher. And those, if you look at how it connects to the bar on the right, those households who do get a voucher often wait years to access one. 8% of folks are waiting more than 5 years. And the 10% of folks who are receiving vouchers in this chart are waiting, in most cases, more than 1 to 2 years. So where are they waiting? Folks are waiting in precarious, doubled up, tripled up, or homeless situations. So the Housing Choice Voucher Program, as one of the sort of 3 legs of that stool that I laid out, is incredibly important. If you can go to the next slide. And in your state, folks are waiting for more than 2 years to receive a voucher. So you can see how Washington in this map sort of relates to other states around the country in terms of waiting times for vouchers. So again, I'll just say it one more time, 3 things: preserve what we have, build additional stock where we need it, and increase affordability through an expansion of rental assistance and the Housing Choice Voucher Program in particular, for as many people as we possibly can.
So on that note about expanding the voucher program, for folks who maybe haven't been following goings on Capitol Hill as much as we have at the center, Anne, can you tell us a little bit about kind of the prospects for actually making that happen and what we might see going forward?
Sure. So I spend a lot of my time working on this particular issue, and it is very near and dear to my heart. So I'll start by saying there is a package moving through Congress. In some places, folks call it the reconciliation package. More recently, it's being referred to as the Build Back Better Act. And it is being negotiated right now in Congress. This is a really critical time. And I will just caveat this by saying, if folks are listening to this that on a day that is not October 5th, this information might be a little bit out of date because things are moving very quickly up on Capitol Hill related to the reconciliation package. But let me tell you what's happening right now. The housing portion of the Build Back Better Act includes a number of resources that we desperately need to begin to right the ship that you described again at the top, the pre-pandemic situation around housing affordability and homelessness, but also the impacts of the pandemic. So first, it includes $80 billion to make capital improvements to public housing. I know that is predominantly an East Coast investment, but there are some investments to be made on the West Coast with that funding. What that will allow us to do is preserve the public housing that we have that serves low and extremely low income households in affordable, safe, stable housing. Because right now we lose thousands of units per year just to needing repairs. So we must make sure that our public housing has the capital improvements it needs to be safe and stable for the families who live there, and that we don't lose any further. The second thing that I noted was increasing stock where we need it, and the big chunk of funding in the reconciliation bill for this purpose is through the National Housing Trust Fund. That fund is right now slated at $37 billion. And I'm going to put some links in the state data looks like on the National Housing Trust Fund. $37 billion nationwide to build housing that's affordable to households at 30% of the area median income or lower. And then again, sort of most important to us at the center is the portion of the package that includes rental assistance. And that is right now at $90 billion. It includes $15 billion for about 260,000 units of project-based rental assistance. And what that is it's rental assistance that is tied to a unit or to a building, and that is administered by HUD. So HUD has contracts directly with developers, as many of you know, to support the long-term operating needs of units that are built for low-income people. The second and largest part of the rental assistance bucket is this expansion of the Housing Choice Voucher program, which we just made a strong case for. And while that expansion amounts to about only 1/5 of the recovery bill's investment in housing, it would actually do more than any other housing policy in the legislation to reduce homelessness and other hardship that Alicia described for people who struggle most to afford a home. At that level, at the $75 billion level, we would assist an estimated 1.7 million people with 750,000 vouchers after the full phase-in period, which is 5 years within the legislation. And that would include 660,000 children, 180,000 seniors, and 330,000 people with disabilities. If you go to the next slide, Alicia. We also are very interested in expanding the Housing Choice Voucher program because we know that that program would reduce the large racial disparities in housing opportunity, because 71% of those assisted by the vouchers would be people of color. So those are all incredibly important reasons. And then there's one other specific Washington State note that I wanna make, and that is, I said earlier that the public housing investment could be seen as potentially an East Coast kind of investment, because that's where a lot of our nation's public housing is. But the West Coast was not left out of these negotiations. And the Housing Choice Voucher expansion that is included in the reconciliation bill actually lifts the cap on being able to project base these units, which means that local public housing authorities could actually use those to support the operating needs of projects that are already in the pipeline and being built, or projects that would be built with resources from this same reconciliation package, like the Housing Trust Fund. So, there have been some changes to the program. The cap can be lifted for projects that are serving people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, as well as a few other types of communities or projects. So that's really important to know on the West Coast.
All right, so, we know that what's happening now in Congress is no guarantee for what, will happen in the future, right? Things are moving quickly. So is there anything that, states or localities can do either in support of this federal legislation or themselves to try and address some of the housing needs that they're seeing on the ground?
Yeah, and I'm going to start thank you, Alicia, for that question. It's a really important one. And like I said, it's a really critical time right now to ensure that folks understand what is in this bill, as well as what they can do to support these resources staying in this bill. So I'm putting 2 links in the chat. Those links are to state level data. As you mentioned before, Alicia, we like to publish state level data, so our partners at the state and local level can really see how these policies will impact them. Our partners at the National Low Income Housing Coalition have done the same. So those 2 links will take you to what your state's allocation is under the National Housing Trust Fund as it is currently written, as well as how many folks would be served under the currently written expansion of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So just to not keep you in suspense, for the Housing Trust Fund, the state of Washington would get $851 million in its national allocation. And the expansion of the Housing Choice Voucher Program would result, if it passes as currently written, would result in an additional 15,000 households being served in the state of Washington with the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So right now, as I mentioned, is a really critical time to ensure that your members of Congress know how important these investments are to the kind of progress you want to make locally at the state level in terms of housing instability and homelessness. I know homelessness is a big issue in Washington state. So we would just ask that you make sure that your media outlets and that all of your partners have this data and that can really make the best case to your members of Congress about why they should be supporting the housing investments in the Build Back Better Act. And for the folks who are watching who are in the homelessness field, I also want to note that the $75 billion expansion in the Housing Choice Voucher Program specifically has a set aside for people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness at $24 billion. It will be, if it passes, the single biggest infusion of resources into homeless assistance that we have ever seen. And it would serve 205,000 households at the end of the implementation period. So big resources. We have a big opportunity in front of us. And I really hope that, that folks can use this data to make the case to their members of Congress. And I think with that, Cheryl, we'd like to take some questions from the audience. Do we have any questions?
We don't have any right now, but I want to just say a few things and then ask the participants, because I know we have a lot of them out there. I just checked at how many we have. So we've got a lot of people watching. So if you have any questions, please drop them in chat and I will send them. We have a few more minutes. But one of the things I do want to mention to everybody, your point about making sure that the media gets the information is really pretty critical. And if anybody would like to have a better understanding of how to do that, go back to this platform and take a look at the session we had just prior to Deputy Secretary Todman's presentation. And it was WB1 and it was all about messaging. So it will give you a lot of tips as to how to take this information and digest it and move it forward. So anyway, let's see. Do you see many of the federal housing supports as temporary while the economy recovers from COVID, or are they entering a time when more affordable housing subsidies are necessary on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, that's a great question, Colton. Thank you so much for asking it. So, you know, when you saw the chart that I put up around the four big buckets of funding that have been passed and are in various stages of implementation related to the pandemic, all of those are temporary and except for the home program. That's a permanent. It's a one-time infusion, but the housing will be permanent. But those are one-time infusions to these programs. And while they will help us recover from the pandemic, I think the point that Alicia was making so strongly with the use of that data is that we actually had things were already bad before the pandemic, and we were already experiencing very high rates of homelessness, increasing unsheltered homelessness, 24 million people who are rent burdened across the country, and affordable housing shortages across the country. So to complement the sort of shorter term band-aids that we needed to have in place that include the emergency rental assistance program and the other three programs that I mentioned, we think that we need to have permanent solutions to this crisis, and that includes eventually getting to universal housing vouchers. That would be a massive expansion of the current housing voucher program. But if we can get to universal housing vouchers, which was actually something that President Biden talked about when he was running for president last year, we would have a system that really is in place permanently, that can expand and contract when the need changes over time. And as I mentioned, that would be better for both families and individuals who are on that precipice that Alicia described, but also for landlords who wouldn't have to wait so long to be paid the rent if folks could enroll in a housing choice voucher program when they're eligible.
Good, thank you. I get the obvious question to that is also, how does that get accomplished? Given that I know that I'm not asking you to be political here, because I know that that's a difficult one, but it is really challenging to get anything through Congress right now. And would it have to be a congressional situation, or could it be done through executive order? What would have to happen to make that happen?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. So right now, what we are really focused on is the Build Back Better Act that will include, hopefully, if we all do our jobs, it will include an expansion of the housing choice voucher program, and the project-based rental assistance program that would serve about 1 million more households than we currently serve in those programs. But if that moves forward, then that buys us some time to work on these permanent changes that we need. And right now, the piece of legislation that is in Congress that has been introduced, it's been introduced by Chairwoman Waters from the House Financial Services Committee. It is called the Ending Homelessness Act of 2021. I would encourage folks to take a look at it. It includes a number of really important policy and budget pieces, but most importantly, it includes the ramp up to universal vouchers. So that's really the vehicle that is in play right now up on the Hill. But your point is well taken about politics, for sure.
Yeah, that's always the problem. So anyway, we'll just do one last question that Colton has forwarded over to us from Maria. And do you have any data on the homelessness contracting COVID and the vaccination rate of homeless?
Yeah, that is also a very good question. And that data, as far as I know, and Alicia can chime in here, I have not seen any data being collected at this point. As most of you probably know, the 2021 point in time count, which is how HUD usually collects data from folks across the country, folks could ask for a waiver so that they didn't have to do it. So there is going to be an incomplete data set for that year. They are working on a number of ways to extrapolate. But I have not seen any comprehensive national data on homelessness and COVID-19 or vaccination rates. But it looks like Alicia might have some answers to that, or an answer to a different question. Have you seen anything, Alicia, on homelessness?
Yeah,
I'm not sure. Yeah.
okay.
Great.
Yeah, let's see. Okay, I think we probably need to end. I know there's a short question regarding the Pulse survey on the online survey sent out to a nationally representative sample of adults across the country. Okay, good. Thank you, Alicia. That's really helpful. Okay.
Can I just ask one other quick thing, Alicia? The Pulse survey, that's who's responding to it. How do folks access that data?
Yeah, so it's publicly available on the Census website. There's just tables you can download. We can also, I don't know if you have the link handy to the hardship tracker. We could put that in the chat, but we also, let me put it in the chat here. We also try and update this page every 2 weeks when the new Census Pulse data comes out. We kind of our analysis, and so you can also bookmark this page and keep an eye on it. We're gonna get new data comes out on Wednesdays. It usually takes us like a couple days to process it, but definitely check back every other week to see what we've added.
Oh, that's great. Very helpful. This was so informative. I know that you have touched on not only the data, but some solutions. And that's what I think has been so outstanding. Thank you very much for joining us at Housing Washington. Honestly, I can't thank you enough because it's been important for me to reach out to you guys because you do great work and I wanted an opportunity to showcase that here at Housing Washington. So thank
you so
you
much
all
for having us.
Yeah.
Thrill. So I hope all of you will stay on or join the next one, which will be our plenary session over the lunch hour with Diane Gentel and Emily Kadick. So we'll talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.
Strong.
Bye. Thank you, you guys. You were terrific.
Great. Thanks. Take care.